Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on Tele-Assessment. My name is Kate Eberly-Walker and I'm the CEO of Presence Learning. I'd like to start us off with some housekeeping to ensure we make the most of our time. First, Q&A. We've saved time for Q&A at the end of our presentation, but throughout the presentation, please type questions as you have them into the Q&A box on your screen, and we will get to as many as possible at the end of the session. Next, if you have any audio or tech-related questions, you can also put those in the Q&A box, and our producer will answer those for you there. And lastly, we will be distributing a recording of today's webinar and the slide presentation that's included to all attendees, so you will receive that recording after the session. And now on to today's topic. So this webinar is brought to you by Presence Learning. We are the leading provider of online special education related services for K-12 districts. We've been delivering remote online services for more than 10 years now, including speech-language therapy and assessments, occupational therapy, and behavioral and mental health services. And through our work, we also saw an acute need from our school partners, many in remote areas of the country, to conduct remote online psychoeducational assessments as well to ensure that students were being assessed in a timely manner. We take a research-based approach to our work, so several years ago, when we identified this need, we partnered with Riverside, the publisher of the Woodcock-Johnson 4 cognitive and achievement tests, to validate the appropriateness and equivalency of a remote online administration of that assessment. And the success of that research and the subsequent use of remote assessments across our school partners has led to a growing and expanding tele-assessment practice for us. To help during school closures, in addition to webinars, we've been running Teletherapy 101 and Tele-Assessment 101 training sessions for our school clients, and are setting them up to use our teletherapy and assessment platform to allow school-based teams to continue serving their students at home. We really believe in providing this guidance in the interest of continuing services for all students throughout this challenging and changing educational landscape. There are a lot of questions right now on these topics, and we feel our panel is well positioned to provide us some answers today. Our experts today have vast experience with every aspect of tele-assessment. We have Stephanie Taylor, Clinical Director for Presence Learning. We have Dr. Jordan Wright, a leading researcher on tele-assessment, and we have one of our school partners, Nikki Jansrud, the Program Director at Wilmac Multi-District Special Education Unit, who has been putting tele-assessment into practice during school closures. I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Taylor to get us started on what I hope will be a very informative session for all of you, and most importantly, one that will truly help you design an approach for continuing to support your students in the next year wherever they need to be. Thank you for joining us, and Stephanie, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Kate. We indeed have an interesting time on our hands, but I want to start talking a little bit about tele-assessment in general, and then I'll talk about tele-assessment during school closures. With extended school closures in place, a lot of schools nationwide are really grappling with questions about conducting these eligibility assessments. The questions they're asking are, how can schools best continue to serve students in need of evaluation? How can the needed evaluations be conducted remotely without compromising validity, as well as which assessments are appropriate? And these really are the key questions, because these are the things that we look to every day to determine if we are getting the right results for our students and if we are serving them in the way that they need to be served. The real first question is, let's talk about tele-assessment in general. So tele-assessment is administering assessments remotely with a live person on each end. I really just want to make it clear here that we are not talking about any type of computerized assessment, that this is really about still creating that person-to-person contact, having that trained professional on the other end, seeing the student via video. This is a remoteness of the assessment, but not a removal of the judgment of the professional. Also, standardized tele-assessment has been in use for several years. I know that for most of the audience, it is a brand new concept. It's not been your standard of practice, but it has been used at brick and mortar schools as well as in virtual schools that are in the home setting for several years. Particularly, we have experience with not only completing speech and language assessments and occupational therapy assessments, but the school psychology, psychoeducational assessments that are so needed, and all of those professionals are so sparse that we really have to continue to serve the students and not be afraid to look at what has been done and what we can learn from that. Also, Tele-Assessment does have a research base, and I will let Jordan talk about that particularly, but there is information out there to be had, and considering all of that information is going to be key in making the decisions that you are going to make for your districts. So why Tele-Assessment? First thing is it creates access. We all talk a lot about the lack of professionals available to schools, and that is true, but it's also slightly misleading. There are a lot of places where there is actually a supply of related service professionals, and that Tele-Assessment allows us to reallocate that supply to meet the demand. So we can take those areas where there are an excess of professionals and get them to the areas that cannot be served. Also to the areas that need to have, it takes a lot of time to get from place to place. There are a lot of reasons it creates access. Also to specialists, so not just to a professional in general, but also to specialists. There are times when a student needs a particular professional, they need someone that has expertise in an area, and that's not typically what you're going to find in your generalist that you hire on the ground. Tele-assessment is another way to spread out those resources. And those are really why it was created and embraced prior to COVID-19. As far as the overview of the landscape, for those of you who are new, I want to talk a little bit about preparing you for really embracing all the aspects of what you have to consider. So schools are looking for alternatives, as I'm sure that is partially why you're here. But do rest assured that it is not new. Tele-assessment is not new, but it's also not foolproof. So today we really want to arm you with knowing what to consider. So everyone knows that no assessment process is without complexity, and all measurements are imperfect. But the key is mitigating the variables to increase the confidence interval, and that's what we want to arm you with today. I also want you to know it's not a universal replacement for in-person assessment. I don't think there will ever be a world where 100% of students will be appropriate for tele-assessment. That's not realistic. But there are also many who are, and embracing it can continue to help those students receive their services. Also, it can be done completely or competently and with confidence when all factors are considered. Again, I'm going to let Jordan delve into some of those considerations so that you can walk away today with some concrete ideas. But so much goes into creating and ensuring standardization to the extent possible. So knowing what you are trying to account for is the difference between a trained professional and everybody else. And lastly, really take into account the utilization of the assessments and the valid research to support them. So not every assessment out there has been deemed to be equivalent when conducted remotely versus in person. It can't be a universal statement that you're either engaging in tele-assessment or you aren't. It really has to be instrument by instrument, and there does need to be more work in the research. More research is needed on particular assessments, but there are assessments that are supported, and really looking at those particularly is going to be helpful in your path forward. I am now going to turn the time over to Jordan to talk a bit about the research and give you some of the concrete basis, and then go through the variables. Jordan?
Thanks, Stephanie. So I started doing this research a few years ago. I was mostly interested, the history of the research on tele-assessment actually started with neuropsychology in older adults. There's quite a bit on measures like the R bands and things that we don't use in schools very much. But I was interested in, like Stephanie was talking about, access, not just for remote areas, but also for under-resourced areas. I think there are a lot of, I'm here in New York City. We have lots of school districts with an extremely high student to school psychologist ratio, and school psychologists are just overwhelmed. So I was interested in ways we could add resources to not just rural schools and remote schools, but also to under-resourced schools. So we started looking, and we did partner with Riverside and started with the Woodcock-Johnson. We are just finishing a project with the WISC right now. The research is pretty young at the moment. There aren't that many studies out there. Unfortunately, there are not very many measures that we've looked at or that anybody has looked at to know if they are equivalent, to really look into the equivalence. Equivalence studies are somewhat complex and difficult to design. You can't just give a kid two different Woodcock-Johnsons at two different times in two different modalities and compare them, because we know there are learning effects. So we have to collect a pretty large sample that's counterbalanced and pretty complex. You can look into the literature. These are published studies. But in general, it takes a lot of resources to show equivalence of a new format of a test. So we've done some tests, and although the research is young, it's pretty promising. We're seeing relative equivalence. When I think about sort of an analogy or a metaphor for this, I think about going to the DMV and doing my eye test. All of our tests are imperfect. They are all proxies for some sort of underlying skill or functioning or trait, or most of what we do are skills and abilities in this setting. So they're sort of proxies for that. And I think about this eye test as my ability to read the letters. Doing this in the alternative format, what we found is as if they put sort of a plexiglass in front of the eye exam. So I am still looking at the letters and I should still be able to read them. It's still relatively accurate, but maybe a little less precise, a little bit less precise. We're not seeing differences that are any larger than the standard error of measurement. So what that means is the precision of individual subtests, of individual indices, how precise they are in terms of their standard error of measurement. That error, which gives us our confidence intervals, is larger than the difference between the scores that emerge from the two different formats of giving the tests. So what this means is if we do this work very, very carefully, then we can actually apply all of the norms, the standardization. We can use all of the validity research from our traditional in-person administration of these tests, and we can apply them to this new way. If we show that they're equivalent, then we get to use those norms. We get to use all of the research that we have built around specific tests, and confidently say, this is a good estimation of this child's functioning right now, this child's ability right now, their skills and their abilities right now. We are in an unprecedented time, and unfortunately, we cannot accomplish everything we need to do with the very few tests that have been evaluated in this way. It's very unfortunate, but we do have to branch out. We do have to use what we know about standardized administration, alternative administration formats, what we know about the research behind them, and what we know from our training, from our experience about what these tests actually are measuring and how they're measuring them. We have to be able to apply that to some tests that have not been given as much research scrutiny as the few tests that we have. And I'll talk about some strategies for doing that. So the things to be mindful and careful of what we're trying to do when we do remote administration of any measure, we're trying to approximate as closely as possible the standardized administration format. So we have to really think through what's happening on our side, what's happening on the client side, what's happening with the kid, what's happening in their environment. We have to think very carefully about all of these things to say what could be affecting their performance on any given test that is different than the optimal environment of sitting in our office right across from us in a quiet environment without a lot of distraction, without a lot of crazy things on the walls, with a somewhat hopefully friendly person giving them one-on-one attention, right? All of these things are meant to get a child's optimal performance. Some people in the literature have started calling like IQ tests and similar cognitive tasks optimal performance tests. They're not typical performance tests. They're not how a kid always behaves in the classroom. It may not be, for example, if I gave a test of reading in this ideal environment, it's what they're capable of reading. That may not be how well they read in their everyday class when there are a lot of distractions. We're looking for their optimal functioning. So we need to think about all those different areas that could affect what is going on and all of the psychological processes that are involved in a kid responding to stimuli, responding to prompts that are less now than ideal, that are less than optimal. Again, we're sort of thinking, what is the plexiglass? What is the thing that is slightly different, that is maybe making our measurement a little bit less precise, but not necessarily invalid or incorrect? So here are some things that we think about in terms of best practices. And I'll talk about sort of best practices. I'll talk about good practices, because right now, my mantra has been, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think we can be doing a lot of good out there that's not perfect. And I think I am guilty of this. When we use a measure a lot, we get a little bit lazy and we forget our psychometric understandings of what these measures are and what they're really doing, and that they are proxies. We tend to reify some of these scores and say, ooh, this score is their true working memory ability or their true processing speed ability. And we get a little bit lazy because we are using these so much. It's our own brain's way of creating a shorthand. We don't have to reinvent all of that from scratch every time we use it. Unfortunately, during this time, we do have to kind of reinvent that. So the first thing is the proctor. Best practice really is needing to have somebody on the client side, on the student side, to help out logistically. This proctor is not a psychologist. It's not a school psychologist. It's not a school counselor necessarily. It's nobody that needs training. They need some guidance. They need a little bit of guidance. Now, my research has not used parents in the home. However, clinically, I have used parents and sort of finagled a way to create a bug in the ear where I am on, maybe Zoom or some platform with the kid sort of watching me, but I'm also on my cell phone talking to a parent with their earphones in for whenever I need them. So I can mute the screen, I can go to the phone and say, ooh, could you give them the response booklet right now? Having that person there does two things. One, it, again, in terms of mimicking standard administration procedures, it does put somebody physically in the room with the kid so that we do not need to ask a kid to do a bunch of logistical, paper shuffling or now go get this. We can ask a person to do that to minimize any extra tasks or extra cognitive load that we're asking to put on the student. Again, I want to emphasize that, even in the research, we are, offering gentle guidance to these proctors. We're giving them a 3-minute spiel ahead of time. We're not doing a full-on training with them. Well, I'll say I was not expecting a pandemic. I won't speak for everybody else. So I was not expecting to have to do this in people's homes with their parents, potentially as proctors, where we would not be able to dispatch a sort of a independent third party there. So we don't have research on using a parent and how that might affect it, but we got kind of lucky because we were using these people who are not necessarily professionals. The skill set needed for the proctor is nothing more than we need to do with a parent. Test security. Test security is a really interesting one in this time. Again, there are best practices. We do the best we can with test security. I will give props right now to the test publishers. The test publishers right now have, I think, done a very good job of being flexible and providing access to digital materials. I know, on their platforms, they have offered a lot of stimulus materials in, PDF-like formats so that they can be given over telehealth platforms. This has improved access. It's also lightened the sort of ethical load on us a little bit, because tacitly they are giving us permission to use them in that way. We don't have to worry about using them in this way and worrying about test security, because we are losing some control over them. We cannot control if somebody has some sort of screen capture video recording on their side of the computer. I think the number of people who are doing this, and especially in our population, is probably pretty low, but we just can't control that. But we also don't want to be mailing out a stimulus booklet to somebody. The stimulus books with the actual items and pictures and all that kind of stuff, we want to maintain control over that. So we do want to build those into a virtual space, a digital space. We don't want to be mailing that out. Response booklets, on the other hand, maybe we do want to physically mail out, and best practice might be to watch a parent open the package on the video at the time of evaluation, hand it to the kid, watch that, include a prepaid envelope for them to mail it back if you're using that sort of technique, and watching them put it in the envelope and mail it. Again, we can't control if they're going to Xerox these things. We can't, but we can take measures to reasonably try and protect test security. Equipment. I'm not going to talk about all the specifics of the equipment. I will tell you, in our research, we did use a computer, obviously with a webcam. This is necessary. We need to see some face-to-face. I think that removing the face of the examiner from the student's view would add not just plexiglass, but some somewhat opaque plexiglass to the vision test. I think that adds too much variation from standard administration. The standard administration really relies on that face-to-face contact with the evaluator, so we need that webcam. We use also a document camera. Now, this may be prohibitive, and I'll tell you, in my own practice, I do not use this because my clients, I'm in New York City, we are sequestered to our homes. We can't go anywhere. Most of my clients do not have a web camera or don't have a document camera that they can point down at if they're writing or manipulating materials. We did do that in our research. That is best practice. But we may have to give up some of the subtests, and we may have to substitute some other subtests if we can't see what is going on. I'm thinking of manipulating blocks or a tower test or something like that. Even if you could get them the physical materials, if we can't see what is going on clearly on the desk in front of them, on the table in front of them, we're not going to be able to give that in a reliable and valid way. So we really need to think about subtest substitutions. I will say that some of the test publishers have done a really good job of putting out information and research on subtest substitutions. There are colleagues who are really researching this and doing a good job of researching what can be substituted for what within tests or supplemented with other tasks. And that environment. And when I think of the environment, I think of who is this kid across from me and what is going on. So the obvious stuff is the physical environment. If there is chaos in the home, and if a one-room apartment and there are kids running around and screaming, we're not going to get the student's optimal performance. We're not going to get a good representation of what they're able to do compared to a normative sample that had a quiet environment. That's sort of the obvious thing. But we also want to be mindful sort of developmentally how I think now more than ever, more kids are actually quite used to using a computer and looking at videos on the screen. I think a lot of schools have moved to this. I certainly know my daughter's school has moved to this. So that's less of a concern, but we do need to think developmentally. We need to think about their age. We need to think about what is appropriate. We need to think about what tests are appropriate. And that doesn't mean just using tests only because they are validated in this way. I tend to think about if I wouldn't give a test to a kid, if I just think it's an inappropriate test for a kid in person, then why would I ever think of doing it in this space? I just because it's been given online or it's available online doesn't mean we want to start using tests that are inappropriate for a given kid developmentally or presentation-wise. We want to really think about the kid. We want to think about what is going on for that student in his or her frame of mind, in what is going on emotionally. Now, it's a very weird time to be testing, and that introduces another sort of variable, another piece of plexiglass. How much emotional distress might this kid be in? We want to take these things into account. When I do think of substituting tests, I think more of constructs. I'll give you an example. When I do dyslexia evaluations, in addition to a general IQ cognitive measure and achievement measure, I want to evaluate for phonological processing. I have a test that I particularly like to use for phonological processing, but right now what I found is actually there is an alternative test of phonological processing that has an online administration format already. That is a good substitution to make. It's not inappropriate for any given kid. It's measuring the same sort of constructs, but I have to alter standardized administration procedures less for a test that already has an online option. So these are sort of 4 large considerations we really want to think about when we're trying to approximate standardized administration. I just want to recap really quickly. The best practice and what we've used in our research may not be entirely feasible at this time, but we want as much as possible to recreate and reconstruct as closely as we can standardized administration procedures. And we want to think critically about all of those different variables. These 4 are large buckets. There are many others as well, but we want to think about all those variables that provide plexiglass, that alter the standardized administration in any way. So what I want to encourage is to rely on your professional training. So again, we need to remember that tests are imperfect. All tests are imperfect. They are never getting a true score. Sometimes I say that I wish I could take a kid's blood and tell their working memory, or put them on a scale and tell them their processing speed, but we can't do that. They are always a proxy. So the best practice, not just in this scenario, not just in the context that we're in right now. But best practice is always going to be to use multiple data sources, to triangulate data, right? Assessments are one piece of data. Our scores are going to be a little less precise. Like Stephanie said, I talk about it as widening our confidence intervals a bit. I don't have a statistical or mathematical computation for how much to widen confidence intervals, but I want to think about the fact that our measurement is a little less precise when we do it in this way. I also want to think about which direction it's likely to be in. We don't necessarily want to widen our confidence intervals in equal parts on both sides of the score that we achieve, right? So if we are looking at a working memory task, an auditory working memory task, and we know that there is a little bit more distraction, then it's unlikely that their score is going to overestimate their actual working memory skill. It's more likely that the distraction is going to get in the way, and it's going to likely be a slight underestimate. So we need to think about widening our confidence intervals and maybe shifting them a little bit and comparing to other data. The examiner should always be diligent about observation, right? We want to be looking at the students that we're testing, and this is tough. Most of us are not used to administering tests in this way, and so we're juggling. We're, trying to deal with the tech, and we're trying to look at our manuals, and we're trying to, deal with everything, and it can be quite difficult to then also pay close attention to what is going on for the student as you're going. Now, I know this is sort of testing 101. We all know that we need to do behavioral observations throughout. We need to be extra vigilant because, first of all, it's harder to see them through a webcam. So we need to be scrutinizing what we're seeing a little bit more. And we need to be looking a little more closely. So we're all used to, in our offices, noticing behaviors that are a little bit odd or abnormal. We're not as used to doing it in this format. So we need to be a little bit more vigilant about observations of the kids' behavior, about what is going on in their environment, because this can, again, help us contextualize a score, any one score that comes out. So we want to be taking notes on that, because if something weird comes out on a test that we're giving or a subtest that we're giving, we want to know, is this weird because it's weird? Is because it's representing some weird aberration of functioning for the student? Or is it weird because something happened in that moment that we couldn't control and that took us even further away from standard administration procedures? And finally, nothing can replace two things: the triangulation of data, right? Nothing can replace knowing from teachers how a kid is doing, knowing cultural background, having the clinical interview data from parents, having that rich information. Nothing can replace that. Records reviews, developmental history, putting that together with tests, nothing can replace that, as well as clinical judgment. Now more than ever, we need to trust our training. We need to trust our colleagues to understand psychometrics, to understand what tests are and what tests aren't. We need to trust that our field is going to work hard not to reify any one number that comes from any one test, which we shouldn't be doing in normal practice. But I would say now more than ever, we really shouldn't be doing it. So nothing can replace the contextualization of scores within broader data to confirm or disconfirm, and using your clinical judgment in best practice as you use tele-assessment practices.
Thank you, Jordan. The key takeaways of today, before we turn the time over to our school partner to give you some real-world examples of how a school has made the transition and is doing this in the home setting, are really just the big picture of guidance. any guidance that is out right now, whether it be from governmental guidance or district guidance, really should reflect the full picture of information. At a minimum, we need to consider all that is readily available in the published research, tele-assessment experience from clinicians such as Presence Learning. With our depth of experience delivering remote assessments in our partner schools throughout the country, we do feel uniquely qualified to bring more data and perspective to this ongoing dialogue. And we believe that there is value to school administrators in hearing the full picture from the experiences of remote examiners and in reviewing the relevant research. We hope this information can be used to help guide decision makers seeking to make informed choices for their students at this critical moment. Training should be rooted in the research and best practice. As Jordan talked about, there's best practice and there's good practice, and we're always striving in every setting, regardless of COVID-19 or teleassessment, to be best practice. But there are a lot of things that we always have to consider. If we can rely on our training as professionals, as psychologists, also look at the research that is out there and the training that is available, then that training should be geared for your district, for if you are considering engaging in this, at really what is available to you to meet those best practices, and what are the limitations that Jordan mentioned, but also what is out there right now that helps you to get past those limitations as best possible. And in this time of COVID-19, we have expanded our training capabilities to be able to share guidance more broadly with school teams and help them make informed judgments about remote assessments. And we hope that that provides value and ongoing decision making. I'd like to turn the time over now to Nikki Johnsrud to talk about her experience of taking this to her students. Nikki?
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, we actually started looking into tele-assessment approximately 2 years ago. And actually a lot of the reasons that we were looking for tele-assessment are exactly what Jordan and I think you had said or spoke to, Stephanie, as well. We were looking at high ratios. We were looking at, our only school psych program in our area had closed. We were finding it difficult to find school psychologists, special education teachers, speech and language pathologists, occupational therapists, and we definitely kind of hit the jackpot when we had found Presence Learning. And what I mean by that is it was a place to be able to find assistance for multiple areas that we were looking for. And in our area, we also experienced a significant population influx. So I'm kind of jumping around, but it definitely was able to bring the opportunity of expertise from other school psychologists and practitioners across the nation, and bring some of their expertise that they had experiences in. With some students, we had 60 students that represented 60 different countries in one of our schools. And maybe for you guys, wherever you're from, that's a common occurrence, but in Western North Dakota, that was not a common occurrence. So it was definitely something that it was worth looking into. So that was the start of our journey. What we did next is we wanted to look at, I know one of the questions is, how did we consider to best practice of guidance and making sure that we overcome those barriers. And I think it goes back to, again, referencing what Jordan talked about. It's no different than if you're going to have that meeting or that team sitting down and discussing what assessments are going to be completed with those students. It's really figuring out what's in the best interest and what are all those different areas. Again, referencing Jordan, he talked about technology, equipment, the environment, things like that. In my mind, I will say in the beginning, I was skeptical about tele-assessment. I'm a school psychologist by training, and we work really hard to develop those relationships with students. to try to get the best assessment and the clearest picture about them. And so I was hesitant in the beginning, but I also realized we had to find another way of being able to provide those services to our students because we were not getting any more professionals to move to Western North Dakota to meet the needs. And so we really had to look outside of that box. So in my mind, as I started to wrap, or not just my mind, but as our unit started to wrap our head around it, we range from a one-room schoolhouse all the way to a school district that they have 1,500 high school students. So it really run the gamut, and we have a lot of windshield time that is added into our fees and things like that that is passed on to our school district. So this is a way of being able to also capture some of that time back. But I wanted to be clear that we don't use tele-assessment for every kid. We do not make a blanket statement. We really go back to that team decision-making process and going through all of those different areas that are going to affect the child. We really need to dig deep and answer a lot of the questions. What does the home environment look like? Are the parents willing and capable of being that person, like Jordan was talking about, to be able to, okay, now hand them the stimulus book, those types of things. Do they have the technology? Is it an availability for us to get them the technology? At the core, do we think this is a child that can actually complete the assessment online? Do we think that they're a child that has severe anxiety and maybe parents are saying they are struggling even to just get online with their teacher in Google Classroom or Zoom or something like that? So really digging deep and determining, I like what you guys coined, maybe it isn't the best practice, but it's good. It's the best that we can do in the circumstances that we have. So what we started to do is start to triage, which a lot of us do on a daily basis, figuring out what students could be assessed in this environment, what students need to have face-to-face, and what students that could be held off until next fall, depending upon what that's going to look like too. So it really, and that's still evolving as well. Sometimes we think kids are going to be a good candidate to have the assessment, and come to find out maybe it didn't work. But that also happens in real time too. We've all been in those situations where we're assessing a student in a classroom or a closet, depending upon where you've been, and the carpet cleaner goes by, or the vacuum cleaner goes by, or you have a fire drill. So those types of things may happen in a school setting, whereas at home it may be little brother, fell off his bunk bed and he busted into the room crying. So those are real variables. However, I think it really comes back to integrating the team and making sure that, and that I have to say, having used presence learning, that has been an amazing team effect, is being able to have those school psychologists from presence learning, and they really want to be an integral person. They want to listen to what you want from them and make sure that they're adjusting to what your needs are, not that they're coming in and saying this is how it's going to be. So that has been extremely helpful, that people didn't have to readjust to something new or different. It takes a little bit of time, like anything. Even if you get a new person to come into your unit or your school, it's going to take a little time for everybody to learn their ins and outs. The biggest thing that I would say that my takeaway was really making presence learning and my on the ground school psychologists, making us be a team together. And that's been extremely helpful. We have meetings together, and because not everyone was on board in our school districts to have tele-assessment. People are worried that it may, there's a lot of questions about it. Anytime there's something new or change, right, there's always questions as to questioning the validity of it. Isn't it better to have somebody on the ground, things like that. But it really does come back to, there are students that we can assess and need to be assessed during this time. And so, and with the federal government and the other powers that be, they haven't extended some of our timelines and things like that. So again, I'm not saying every student would be assessed in this mode. However, there are students that it has been, we actually have seen some students really rise to the occasion and do well in this situation. So it has been a positive one. There were definitely some learning curves to come along the way, but it has allowed us to, and we're not just a one-shot deal. We have presence learning for next year too. We know that we are going to have a difficult time finding professionals in those areas: school psychology, occupational therapy, speech and language pathologists. We're going to struggle to find those staff members to meet our needs. So this is a great way where we can add those people, add the professionals in, and be able to have uninterrupted services to our students and our schools. So it has, I'm guessing all of the bumps in the road will be worked out by next year. But I think it's also, it's so poignant that we have this available to us now, because we know it's so uncertain in the COVID-19 as to how long this is going to be. So it gives us options, which is to say a lot in this time.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Nikki, and thank you, Stephanie and Jordan as well. This is Kate. I'm back to do our Q&A. We have so many questions. There's well over 100 questions, and they're rapidly coming in. So we're not going to be able to answer all of them here, but let's jump in and answer as many as we can, and we'll follow up afterwards on those that we didn't get to. So the first question I want to ask to you, Jordan, and I'm summarizing a number of questions that I'm seeing come in on this general topic of, is it essential to do these assessments right now? Is it worth it to try this? Is it necessary? What is the reason to try to do this right now versus waiting until school goes back to normal, whenever that may be?
Thanks. I'm going to give a probably wholly unsatisfying answer to that. I am not going to tell you that all of these are necessary or all of them are unnecessary. I tend to take a more social justice approach to this. I think that even though our society is somewhat on pause at the moment, our children's development is not. I see that in my own child. They are continuing to develop. Their brains are developing, their emotional worlds are developing in a very weird context, but they are continuing to develop. I think from a social justice perspective, that and they are continuing in school, I think that there are too many kids out there who are struggling and not getting the services they need if they go unevaluated. So I think, for me, I err on the side of wanting to know more information as soon as possible, because development happens quickly and kids fall behind quickly. So if there is a kid who is struggling in traditional schooling and now they're at home and having to do Google Classrooms and all that kind of stuff, we may see the volume turned up on their struggles. They may do better at home. I don't know, that they have super supportive parents who use really good techniques with them. However, if they are struggling, we are doing them a disservice, and I think a great disservice, if we are not evaluating them and advocating for them to get the services that they need.
Thanks, Jordan. And it's really interesting. I'm seeing a number of other questions and comments pop up on that topic of, the stress and emotional impact of the pandemic, the anxiety being experienced in student and family homes. And I think, some of those are questions about, how can we know, given that the behaviors we observe in these assessments are representative. But I think, you raise an interesting other side of that of, how can we know what we can do to support those students if we don't try now? So I think it's certainly a lively dialogue happening in the space right now. So thanks for your perspective. Another question, again on this topic of, there is a lot of debate going on and a lot of questions on all sides right now. Is one participant asked us, it appears some state organizations are adamantly against tele-assessment because the assessments were not normed for this environment. So what's your response to that, either Jordan or Stephanie or both?
I'm happy to start. Yeah, I think there is a knee-jerk reaction against this, and I absolutely understand it. I understand that again, with the lack of precision, with the slight change in what scores mean, I can understand why organizations, states are totally against this. I would say this is when we as a field, when we as psychology need to come together and advocate for kids. I think we need to make sure that our voices are heard so that kids are not falling through the cracks during this time. That's my main concern, my number one fear when it comes to this period and ethics around our profession and our little area of this profession. My number one concern is that we don't let kids slip away during this period. So we may need to do some advocacy.
Thank you, Jordan. I'm going to add to that. I think what we've seen at Presence Learning with our school customers, school partners, is that also there's just a lack of awareness. A lot of places have issued guidance not knowing that there is a research base. And they're correct that the assessments had not been normed for online administration. That's 100% correct. And we know that there is always going to be need for more research here. However, I think that they are unaware of the equivalency studies that have been done or the information that can be obtained through the current research. So we do find that really a lot of it is just about creating awareness with the state organizations.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephanie. Nikki, I've got a question that I'd love to hear your thoughts on around parents and parents acting as proctors. So we've seen a lot of questions both in general about, what's the right guidance to give parents when they're acting as the proctor at home, and then also a bunch of questions about, are there particular concerns with the parent being in the room and possibly providing responses to the child, whispering from the side, that sort of thing, particularly for gifted assessments. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, Nikki.
Yes, I would be lying if I didn't have and said that I didn't have those same concerns, right? Because as a professional, making sure that we try to account for all of those factors that are going to positively or adversely impact that child's response, and so what we really have to do, it's no different than what you may do when you're going to be talking to those teachers when you would go and get the child to say that you're going to come and take them and do some assessment with them. I think it really comes back to making sure that you are making the right choice. If you're thinking that the parent, based on what you know and the further conversation that you've had with them, they wouldn't be a good candidate for that, then that child wouldn't be a good candidate to do assessment virtually either. However, if you have been able to have good, staffing conversation with the teacher and things like that beforehand, and even talking about that with the parent, specifically saying these are the things, I think that because we are, a lot of us are very stringent to the rules, and so thinking that we're going to allow test security to be that's put at risk, and having someone else that's never been trained, that those are a lot of questions. And so I go back to using your professional judgment, and also you have to be a fact gatherer in this. You really have to talk to those parents and find out, do they have the capability? Do they understand? I think Jordan spoke to it a little bit. Even when I do something like the ADOS or something like that in person, and they're young enough where I have to have the parents there, I do pre-teaching with the parents beforehand, saying, I'm going to ask them to do these types of things for me, and I need you to know that I want them to do it for me, and I need you to step back unless I ask you to do so. And so letting them know what the expectations are, I think that's what's going to alleviate some of those issues, and making sure that everybody knows what their roles are.
Thank you, Nikki. I will add, I do agree that it's all about the pre-teaching. I think that there's a difference out there between guidance and training. We know that parents aren't trained. They are not trained professionals. And I think the key is asking them to interact and only perform the functions that really are just manual, where they are setting up the equipment or getting out the pencil, something to that effect if needed. There's also the ability where you have them on camera to ask them to move to the back of the room, where you can still see them on camera, but you know that they're not in the child's line of sight. You know that they're not cueing or doing anything observably disruptive. So I think there are techniques and ways to address having the parent as the proctor. If you think about what you're going to be trying to account for, there are definitely strategies in order to alleviate that, even if you sometimes have to ask the parent to leave the room. It's all about that conversation ahead of time and finding out what their understanding of the process is and what their expectation of involvement is.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Stephanie and Nikki. So I'm going to jump to another topic. Stephanie, maybe this one's best for you. Could you speak to the specific guidance from OCR and OSEP related to online assessment?
I will. There is guidance out from OCR and OSEP that says if a student requires face-to-face assessment, then extensions should be considered for that student, that the team should come together and make that determination case by case. However, the part on that I want to focus on is what requires face-to-face. The requirement is the key word. Is it that the type of assessment that you're giving doesn't have research for remote assessment? Is it that the type of assessment that you are giving has a great array of manipulatives that cannot be approximated remotely? I would definitely never attempt to give like the BDI remotely. I can't present those manipulatives to that student in a realistic approximation. So that I would say requires in face-to-face. It requires in person to complete that assessment. I think that also goes back to what we talked a little bit about, what is considered essential. So not only is the type of assessment require an in-person administration, but is the situation for that student considered essential? And that really is, again, a group decision and looking at all the aspects of that administration, what assessments you would use, what things are at stake. So there is research to support those certain instruments, as we've talked about. And in those cases, if that was the instrument you would have used with that student in person, then it does stand to reason that those cases, following tele-assessment research and best practices, can be delivered remotely and would not require in person. So I feel like we should definitely look at their guidance and take it to heart, but to really pick apart what some of those words mean.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thank you to all our presenters. We are in our last minute, so I'm going to start wrapping up. A lot of very, very interesting questions left to get to, so I wish we had more time. But I'm going to wrap up with just one last one. Are there specific platforms that better support online assessment administration? What are the telehealth platforms through which we can assess that are considered secure and meet ethical deadlines? And that's a good wrapping up point, just to, again, thank you all for joining today, and to say that, at Presence Learning, we would be happy to talk to anyone who's interested more about our platform, what we've built. We've designed and built platform for remote assessment administration and for teletherapy specifically for school-age children that, we think not only works well, but again, there are a lot of reasons it's very important to work with a platform, or very valuable to work with a platform that is designed for this purpose, that's taken privacy and FERPA and HIPAA into account, and so on. So happy to talk more with anyone who's interested following this session. And of course, Stephanie, Nikki, you've got experience with this as well. And if you have anything to add about your recommendations, or what, Nikki, what you think about when you're evaluating platforms, I think that would be a helpful note to end on for people as well. Looks like there were a lot seeking advice on this.
Yeah, I will actually take that, Kate. When really looking at a platform, at the end of the day, it's looking at what allows you to account for the most variables and what allows you to meet the best practice of what research is available. As we know right now, sometimes document cameras are hard to get, as Jordan mentioned. But when you want to look at what you're getting, are you getting a platform that just lets you display the stimulus to the student, or are you getting the full array of resources and facets that allow you to mitigate for as many potential variables as you need to? And I think that's really what it comes down to, is which things allow you to do that.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. And we'll wrap up on that note. As I said, this session was recorded, and we'll be sharing that recording and a copy of the slides that were used in the presentation with all registrants. So that will be made available to you. Thank you for your time and your interest in this really important topic. And we appreciate getting a chance to take you through some of what we've learned over our time working on this. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.